Hey everyone, welcome back to our second video this week, this time focusing on form. This is a big week to be talking about form because, as I mentioned, Fantomina is an early form of the novel, which means in layperson's terms that this is a story written in prose, in language that is not broken up into line breaks in iambic pentameter, in rhyme or free verse. No, it's not doing any of those things that we've been studying for the bulk of this semester. It's written in prose, in just plain old sentences. This is notable in this class because, with the exception of Julian of Norwich, who saw herself as writing theology, and Marjorie Kemp, who saw herself as writing an autobiography, the literature of this class has been exclusively poetry. We've really been reading poetry for the most part in this class. And that is not a coincidence. As far as historical developments go, that's because up until this point in our class, prose was not considered literature. That was just not a fine form of expression. It was not a form of art. It was considered more suitable for mundane, ordinary writing that did not seek to have, symbolic value or imagery, writing that was just kind of plain and to the point, writing like law, theology, history, writing letters to people. All these forms of writing are usually not trying to incorporate a lot of imagery and symbolism and metaphor and rhyme and all the other things that we associate with literature. So, because of this, only poetry was really seen as having aesthetic, artful, beautiful literary qualities. That was not something really associated with prose. Until this moment. This is marking a kind of sudden shift in the evolution of English literature, where prose suddenly becomes literary. And it not only becomes literary, but it almost displaces poetry as the primary form of literary expression moving forward. When we talk about the novel today, we're really talking about what everyone reads as, or what everyone thinks of as literature. If you say, what are the best books of 2020? You're normally talking about novels, stories that are told in prose form. We rarely, I feel like I'm, shortchanging poetry. I'm not trying to do that. But it's rare that poetry is like the thing we're talking about the most now. It's usually novels. So this is a moment in time in the early 18th century when that shift really starts to happen, when the novel is introduced and ultimately displaces poetry as like the primary vehicle of literary expression. So that's a big deal. I really love to emphasize this moment as being a crucial one in the history of English literature and probably literature beyond England, French literature, Spanish literature, and so forth. So why does prose suddenly become literary in the 18th century? Why does the novel take off? This question, why does the novel take off, is referred to frequently as theory of the novel. Some people teach entire classes on the theory of the novel, people theorizing why the novel takes off. People write entire books devoted to this question. And because I think it's so interesting, I just wanted to very quickly go over 4 theories of many. There are many theories of why the novel takes off, but I think 4 notable theories in the arc of that kind of exploration in the 20th century in particular. So one of the first theories offered was by this European writer named György Lukács. And he proposes a kind of ideological rationale. And he says, the novel becomes important in the early 18th century because at this very same time, Enlightenment is becoming important, the movement toward reason and rationality. The notion of modernity is becoming increasingly important. And this leads to the loss of a coherent, unified understanding of the world. In other words, he's kind of saying, with the introduction of the Enlightenment comes the introduction of skepticism towards religion and skepticism towards existing traditional structures, like, say, monarchy. And with the loss of those institutions, like religion or monarchy, comes the loss of a coherent, unified understanding of the world. So for Lukács, he thinks the novel is responding to that loss of coherent unification. And so prose, because it's not as coherent and unified as poetry, becomes the new medium of expression. Later on in the 20th century, a scholar named Ian Watt says, okay, sure, whatever, existential, whatever. Let's talk about economics. There seems to be an economic rise for the novel here. Because in the 18th century, literacy rates continue to rise, meaning more and more people are able to read, not just the upper classes, but education is kind of including those in the lower classes and increasingly teaching people in the lower classes to read. There is a new demand for prose fiction that the novel satisfies. And I think Watt would say, because prose is generally speaking easier to read than poetry, or it requires less training to read, prose is the thing that these new middle class readers are really after rather than poetry. So to kind of satisfy this new economic demand, people are like, okay, let's write prose. Let's write a lot of prose and a lot of novels because that's what people are hungry for. So Ian Watt proposes this economic rationale. Another rationale that I find really interesting from the 60s is Hillis Miller's claim that the novel explores the consciousness of another. Now take a moment and just kind of replay that phrase in your mind, because I think it takes a second to sink in. The novel doesn't just explore the consciousness of another, someone else's state of mind, but it explores the consciousness of another. Meaning the novel is very self-aware that it's thinking about what other people are thinking and what other people are thinking about other people who are thinking things about other things, other people. So it's really this kind of enmeshed literary form that considers all of these diverse states of mind, these interior states of mind, and what those interior states of mind are thinking about other interior states of mind. So in other words, he says, reading a novel is a form of intersubjectivity. We're kind of merging subjectivity by thinking about all these other states of mind. If we want to kind of sum that up in even more reduced terms, we could just say the novel uniquely explores human social activity. It explores human interactions in a social context. Whereas Paradise Lost is really about this grand subject of the creation of the world and the fall of humankind, novels tend to explore ordinary life. Like Mrs. Fielding went to the market and she saw that the flower seller was out of daisies. That's the kind of thing that is often narrated in a novel. And Hillis Miller saw that as like a new orientation toward human social interactions rather than, say, this grand philosophical or theological approach to the world. Okay, one more theory, a much more recent one from 2008 by Franco Moretti. He approached it from a formal point of view. And by formal, I mean he was thinking about how the form of prose differs from the form of poetry. How do they literally look different on the page? How do they function differently on the page? And what difference does that make to a reader? So he claims that verse is symmetrical. It kind of does the same thing over and over again. You always know what that's going to look like. Prose, meanwhile, is not symmetrical, and it's forward-looking. And that's a phrase that he's really well known for, that prose is forward-looking. And I want to talk a little bit about what he means by that. So he says, unlike verse, prose allows for the acceleration of narrative rhythm, and meaning, whatever meaning a sentence contains, meaning depends so much on what lies ahead that a sentence literally falls into the following one. So essentially, Moretti is kind of arguing that while poetry is very carefully constructed to always do the same thing over and over again, you never really know what you're going to get with a written sentence because there's no pre-existing form that it follows. It just goes on and on and on. As Moretti would say, each sentence falls into the next sentence. For Moretti, he thinks that creates a kind of suspense, an investment on the reader's part that poetry does not create. Because poetry gives us the same form over and over again, there's not this sense of, I need to know what happens in that next sentence, which will lead me into the next sentence, which is all totally unpredictable because there's just no pre-existing form. So I think that's what Moretti means when he talks about prose being forward-looking. You continue to kind of tumble forward into that next sentence. Okay, so we have just surveyed 4 different theories of why the novel takes off in the early 18th century. Lukács said, it's because of the Enlightenment and our newly fragmented sense of the world that poetry is just no longer adequate. Watt says it's because there's all these new readers and they're dying for more to read, so people turn toward prose as a way to satisfy this economic demand. Hillis Miller says it's because the novel explores social interactions in detail in a way that other literary forms have not, so that really takes off and gets people's attention. And then finally, Moretti says, the structure of prose versus poetry creates a kind of unexpected, forward-looking nature in which you continue to kind of tumble forward from one sentence into the next. These are the 4 theories that I have highlighted in this video. With that in mind, I want to know, what do you think? This is the first sentence of Fantomina. And I'll just read it, and you can be thinking about, how does this feel different than poetry? How does this work different than poetry? Okay. A young lady of distinguished birth, beauty, wit, and spirit happened to be in a box one night at the playhouse, where, though there were a great number of celebrated toasts, she perceived several gentlemen extremely pleased themselves with entertaining a woman who sat in a corner of the pit, and by her air and manner of receiving them might easily be known to be one of those who come there for no other purpose than to create acquaintance with as many as seem desirous of it. Okay, I mean, we know that she's basically saying this young woman sees that a bunch of men are talking to a sex worker in the pit of the theater. That's what she observes in this first sentence. But regardless of the content, what is your experience of reading that sentence? You know, we've been reading a lot of poetry. How does reading a sentence like this, which is not poetry, it's just prose, how does that feel different to you as you listen to a story, as you read a story? I'm constantly interested in this question because I think there's no one right answer. But the texture of prose is definitely different than poetry, and it makes us feel in different ways. So I like to hear what people think. You can work that into your discussion post this week. Finally, one other thing that I think is worthy of remark in Heywood's prose is her use of dashes. This is another thing that we don't necessarily see a lot of in poetry, although I think it's probable that it's there. But I do think Heywood's use of dashes is unique and interesting. So I want to read this line too, and before I do, I just want to warn that this is taken from a sensitive moment in the story in which the young woman and Beauplaisir have their first sexual encounter, and many scholars have seen in this description of a rape. So I want you to know that before I read this sentence, and you can fast forward if you'd rather I not read it. It was in vain. She would have retracted the encouragement she had given. Dash. In vain she endeavored to delay till the next meeting the fulfilling of his wishes. Dash. She had now gone too far to retreat. Dash. He was bold. Dash. He was resolute. She fearful. Dash. Confused, altogether unprepared to resist in such encounters, and rendered more so by the extreme liking she had to him. Dash. Okay, so I mentioned all those dashes because I want you to think about, why do you think Heywood includes all of those dashes? What do you think she's doing with that piece of, what do you call that? Punctuation. Why do you think she uses it so often? What does it symbolize? What does it create? What kind of sensation does it create in the writing? I'd love to hear your thoughts on Heywood's use of dashes in your discussion post as well. Okay, that is all I have to share on form this week, but it's a big week in terms of form because we've made giant leaps forward, or giant changes have come our way. I will see you in the context video.